Sure you do, Officer Chen sneered, his hand resting on his holster like he was hoping for a reason to draw it. Another one of you people with excuses. You think I'm stupid? Shut your mouth and know your place. Those words hung in the humid South Carolina air like poison. The kind of poison that has infected this country for centuries. The kind of poison that makes a black man a suspect on his own property. The kind of poison that would soon destroy the careers, reputations, and freedom of every person who spoke those words that August afternoon. Because the man standing with his hands raised on that 15-acre estate was not who those officers thought he was. He was not a trespasser. He was not a criminal. He was not someone they could abuse and forget about by the end of their shift. Marcus Williams was an FBI agent. Not just any FBI agent. He was the lead investigator on a federal civil rights probe into this exact police department. And those officers had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. But let me take you back to where this all started. 3 hours before those handcuffs clicked around Marcus Williams' wrists, he was just a man enjoying a rare day off. Marcus had taken the day away from the FBI field office in Columbia to finally work on the fence line at his newly purchased property in Greenville County. This land meant everything to Marcus. 15 acres of rolling hills and ancient oak trees. A beautiful piece of countryside that represented 20 years of sacrifice, dedication, and service. 20 years of working his way up through law enforcement. 20 years of fighting for justice. And now, finally, a piece of land he could call his own. The American dream made real through blood, sweat, and determination. That Saturday morning, Marcus woke up early with a simple plan. Fix the fence. Enjoy the sunshine. Maybe fire up the grill later. He pulled on his oldest pair of jeans, a faded Howard University t-shirt that had seen better days, and work boots that were already caked with red Carolina clay from previous weekends. He looked like exactly what he was that day. A hard-working man taking care of his property. Nothing more. Nothing less. He had no idea that his appearance would be used against him. He had no idea that someone was watching. He had no idea that a phone call was about to change everything. Jennifer Hartwell lived 3 properties down from Marcus. In the 6 months since Marcus had purchased his land, Jennifer had never once introduced herself. Never waved. Never welcomed him to the neighborhood. Never acknowledged his existence. But Jennifer had been watching. Jennifer had been noticing. And Jennifer had been making assumptions. Dangerous assumptions. The kind of assumptions that get black men killed in this country. When Jennifer looked at Marcus working his fence line that Saturday afternoon, she did not see a homeowner. She did not see a neighbor. She did not see a federal agent who had dedicated his life to protecting and serving. Jennifer Hartwell saw a black man on property she had decided he did not belong on. So Jennifer picked up her phone and dialed 911. She reported an intruder on the abandoned property next to her estate. Never mind that the property was not abandoned. Never mind that Marcus had been living there for 6 months. Never mind that she had absolutely no evidence of any crime being committed. Jennifer saw a black man, and Jennifer decided that was enough. That phone call set everything in motion. Officers Derek Chen and Michael Patterson received the dispatch within minutes. A suspicious black male. Possible trespassing. Property on Miller Creek Road. The 2 officers responded immediately, their patrol car kicking up dust as it rolled down Marcus's long private driveway. Marcus heard the car approaching before he saw it. He looked up from the fence post he was setting, squinting against the afternoon sun. When he saw the patrol car, he smiled and waved. He assumed the officers were lost. Maybe they needed directions. Maybe there was some emergency in the area and they were checking on residents. Marcus could not have been more wrong about their intentions. The patrol car stopped about 30 feet from where Marcus was working. Both doors opened simultaneously. Both officers stepped out with their hands already moving toward their weapons. Marcus felt his heart rate spike. After 20 years in law enforcement, he recognized aggressive body language when he saw it. This was not a friendly visit. This was a confrontation. Hold it right there. Officer Patterson shouted across the property. Step away from the vehicle and show us your hands. Marcus's FBI training took over immediately. Slow movements. Hands visible at all times. Voice calm and clear. He had taught these de-escalation techniques to dozens of officers over the years. Now he was using them to protect himself from officers who saw him as a threat. Officers, I am the owner of this property, Marcus called out, his hands raised above his shoulders. My name is Marcus Williams. I live here. This is my land. Officer Chen approached with his partner, both of them wearing expressions that Marcus had seen too many times throughout his career. Suspicion. Hostility. The look that said they had already made up their minds about who he was and what he was doing there. Sure you do, Officer Chen repeated with a sarcastic laugh. We got a call about someone trespassing on this property. You got any ID to prove you belong here? Marcus kept his breathing steady. I do. My wallet is in my back pocket. May I reach for it slowly? Officer Patterson did not answer the question. Instead, he moved fast. Too fast. He grabbed Marcus by the arm and spun him around violently, slamming him against the side of his own Ford F-150 with enough force to knock the wind out of his lungs. The truck he had purchased 3 months ago. Parked in the driveway of the house he owned. On the land he had bought with money he earned through 2 decades of federal service. We will get it ourselves, Patterson growled into Marcus's ear. Keep your hands where I can see them and do not move. Marcus felt Patterson's hands roughly searching his pockets while Chen stood back with his hand still resting on his weapon. The humiliation burned through Marcus's chest. Not because he was afraid. Marcus had faced down drug cartels, domestic terrorists, and corrupt politicians throughout his career. He had been in situations far more dangerous than this one. The humiliation burned because he knew exactly what this was. This was not law enforcement. This was racial profiling in its purest form. This was the exact behavior he had been investigating for 18 months. And now he was experiencing it firsthand on his own property. Officer Chen pulled out Marcus's wallet and flipped it open. For a moment, nothing happened. Chen just stared at what he was looking at. His face went pale. His hand started to tremble slightly. Marcus watched the whole thing in the reflection of his truck's side mirror. He saw the exact moment Chen realized they had made a catastrophic mistake. Mike, Chen said quietly, his voice tight with sudden fear. Mike, we have got a problem here. But Officer Michael Patterson was not listening. Patterson was too busy riding the adrenaline high that came with dominating another human being. Patterson had already slapped handcuffs around Marcus's wrists and was radiating the kind of aggressive energy that Marcus recognized from years of watching bad cops try to cover their mistakes with more force instead of accountability. I do not care what some fake ID says, Patterson announced loudly. We are taking him in until we can verify ownership of this property. He can explain himself at the station. Chen tried again. Mike, seriously, you need to look at this. I said I do not care, Patterson snapped back. Anyone can get a fake ID made these days. Let the detective sort it out. Marcus stood there in handcuffs, pressed against his own truck, and made a decision that would change everything. He had 2 options in that moment. Option 1 was to immediately identify himself as FBI. Pull rank. Demand to be released. End this humiliation as quickly as possible. That would have been the easy choice. That would have been the understandable choice. But Marcus chose option 2. He chose silence. See, Marcus understood something that those officers did not. He understood that this moment was not just about him. This was about the 18-month investigation he had been building. This was about the pattern of racially motivated stops that his team had been documenting. This was about every other black man and woman who had been treated exactly like this by officers from this department but did not have an FBI badge in their wallet. Those people never got justice. Those people were dismissed, ignored, and forgotten. Their complaints went nowhere. Their dignity was never restored. But Marcus had something they did not have. Marcus had security cameras. 3 weeks earlier, Marcus had installed a state-of-the-art surveillance system around his entire property. For cameras covering every angle. Crystal clear 4K resolution. Audio recording capabilities. Cloud backup that could not be tampered with or deleted. Every single second of this encounter was being captured and stored on a secure federal server that these officers could never access or destroy. So Marcus said nothing. He let them put him in the back of their patrol car. He let them drive him away from his own property. He let them take him to the Greenville County precinct like he was a common criminal. Every moment of silence was another nail in their coffins. Every minute that passed was more evidence for the case he had been building for a year and a half. At the precinct, they put Marcus in an interrogation room. Still handcuffed. Still silent. For 45 minutes, he sat there alone while officers Chen and Patterson apparently tried to figure out what to do with the mess they had created. Through the thin walls of that room, Marcus could hear everything. Heated whispers. Frantic phone calls. The sound of panic spreading through the department like wildfire. Marcus knew they had finally verified his credentials. He knew they had finally realized they had just arrested a federal agent on his own property. He knew they were desperately trying to figure out how to make this go away. But what Marcus also knew, what those officers and their supervisors did not know, was that making this go away was no longer possible. Because Marcus Williams was not just any FBI agent. He was the lead investigator on a federal civil rights probe that had been monitoring this exact police department for 6 months. Every radio transmission. Every dispatch call. Every conversation between officers. All of it recorded. All of it documented. All of it admissible in federal court. When Jennifer Hartwell made that 911 call, it was recorded. When dispatch sent Chen and Patterson to investigate a suspicious black male, that was recorded. When Patterson used racial slurs on his radio while transporting Marcus to the station, that was recorded too. And the worst part for everyone involved in this disaster was yet to be discovered. Because there was one more recording that would seal their fate. One more piece of evidence that would turn this case from a civil rights violation into a criminal conspiracy. Captain Robert Morrison had been on Marcus's radar for months. Morrison was suspected of running a department where racial profiling was not just tolerated but actively encouraged. Where complaints from black citizens were buried. Where officers who crossed the line were protected instead of punished. And 30 minutes after Marcus was placed in that interrogation room, Captain Robert Morrison made a phone call that was captured on a federal wiretap. A phone call where he instructed his officers to teach that man a lesson before checking his identification. A phone call that proved this was not just about two bad officers. This was about a corrupt system. And that system was about to come crashing down. The interrogation room door finally opened. Captain Robert Morrison walked into that interrogation room like a man who had just received a terminal diagnosis. His face had lost all color. His hands were trembling slightly at his sides. The confidence that usually defined his presence was completely absent. Morrison had been running the Greenville County Police Department for 12 years. In that time, he had learned how to handle difficult situations. He had learned how to manage scandals. He had learned how to make problems disappear before they could damage his reputation or his department. But this problem was not going to disappear. This problem was sitting right in front of him, still wearing handcuffs, still covered in red Carolina clay from working his own land, still looking at Morrison with eyes that promised consequences. Agent Williams, Morrison said carefully, his voice barely above a whisper. There has been a terrible misunderstanding here today. Marcus did not respond immediately. He let the silence stretch out between them. He let Morrison sweat. He let the captain feel the full weight of what his officers had done and what Morrison himself had set in motion with that phone call. The phone call Morrison did not know had been recorded. The phone call where Morrison had instructed his officers to teach Marcus a lesson before even bothering to check his identification. That phone call was going to destroy Robert Morrison's career, his freedom, and everything he had spent 12 years building. No, Captain Morrison, Marcus finally replied, his voice calm and steady despite the rage burning in his chest. There has been no misunderstanding at all. This is exactly what I have been investigating for 18 months. And now I have experienced it firsthand. Morrison's face changed. The fear that had been hiding behind his attempt at diplomacy suddenly became visible. Raw and undeniable. Morrison knew about the federal investigation into his department. He had known for months that the FBI was looking into complaints of racial profiling and civil rights violations. But Morrison had always believed he was too smart to get caught. He had always believed his officers were too loyal to turn on him. He had always believed that whatever evidence existed could be explained away, buried, or discredited. Morrison had never considered the possibility that the lead investigator would become a victim himself. That possibility had simply never crossed his mind. Agent Williams, I am sure we can work something out here, Morrison said, his tone shifting from apologetic to desperate. This was clearly a case of mistaken identity. My officers were responding to a legitimate call about a potential trespasser. They had no way of knowing who you were. These things happen. There is no need for this to become a federal matter. Marcus leaned back in his chair and smiled. Not a friendly smile. Not a forgiving smile. A smile that told Morrison exactly how much trouble he was in. A smile that said there would be no working anything out. A smile that promised the kind of justice Morrison had spent his career denying to others. Captain, let me explain something to you, Marcus said slowly. Right now, you are trying to figure out how to make this go away. You are calculating how much this will cost you. You are thinking about damage control and press statements and internal investigations that go nowhere. But here is what you do not understand. This is not going to go away. This stopped being something you could control the moment your officers put their hands on me. Actually, no. This stopped being something you could control the moment you picked up your phone and told your officers to teach me a lesson. The color drained from Morrison's face completely. His mouth opened but no words came out. The realization hit him like a physical blow. They had been listening. The FBI had been listening to everything. That is right, Captain, Marcus continued. We have been monitoring your department's communications for 6 months. Every radio call. Every phone conversation. Every dispatch. All recorded. All documented. All admissible in federal court. When you told officers Chen and Patterson to teach that trespasser a lesson before checking his ID, you were confessing to conspiracy to violate civil rights. You did not know it at the time, but you were building our case for us. Morrison stumbled backward until his back hit the wall of the interrogation room. His legs seemed ready to give out beneath him. 12 years of covering up misconduct. 12 years of protecting bad officers. 12 years of ignoring complaints from black citizens. 12 years of building a department where racial profiling was not just tolerated but encouraged. All of it was about to be exposed. All of it was about to be prosecuted. All of it was about to destroy him. But Morrison was not the only one who would face consequences. This went far deeper than one corrupt captain. This was about a system. A system that allowed Jennifer Hartwell to see a black man on his own property and assume he was a criminal. A system that dispatched officers based on the color of a person's skin rather than any actual evidence of wrongdoing. A system that rewarded aggression and protected abuse. A system that had been operating in plain sight for years while its victims were ignored, dismissed, and forgotten. Marcus thought about all those victims as he sat in that interrogation room. He thought about the files on his desk back at the FBI field office. Dozens of complaints from black residents of Greenville County. Stories of being stopped for no reason. Stories of being searched without cause. Stories of being humiliated in front of their families, their neighbors, their children. Stories that Morrison had made sure never went anywhere. Complaints that were filed and forgotten. Voices that were silenced and ignored. But those voices were about to be heard. Those stories were about to be told. Those complaints were about to become evidence in the largest civil rights prosecution this county had ever seen. The door to the interrogation room opened again. This time it was Officer Chen, looking like he had aged 10 years in the past hour. Chen approached Morrison and whispered something in his ear. Whatever Chen said made Morrison's face go even paler, which Marcus had not thought possible. Morrison looked at Marcus, looked at Chen, and then looked at the door like he was considering making a run for it. "Captain," Chen said quietly but urgently. "There are federal agents in the lobby. They are asking for Agent Williams. They say they have a warrant." Morrison closed his eyes. The last shred of hope he had been holding onto evaporated in that moment. This was not going to be a quiet internal matter. This was not going to be something he could manage behind closed doors. The FBI had arrived in force, and they were not here to negotiate. Marcus stood up slowly, his wrists still bound by the handcuffs that had been placed on him over an hour ago. He looked at Morrison one final time. "Captain, I want you to remember something. Everything that is about to happen to you and your officers is a direct result of choices you made. Choices to profile instead of protect. Choices to abuse instead of serve. Choices to cover up instead of correct. You built this house of lies, and now you get to watch it collapse around you." The minutes that followed were chaos. More officers arrived. Phone calls were made to lawyers and union representatives. Someone mentioned contacting the mayor. Someone else mentioned contacting the press. The entire department was trying to figure out how to respond to a crisis that had no good response. Because there was no way to spin this. There was no narrative that could make this look acceptable. The Greenville County Police Department had arrested an FBI agent on his own property, and the whole world was about to find out. Marcus remained calm through all of it. He had been in difficult situations before. He had faced down dangerous criminals and navigated complex investigations. But this was different. This was personal. This was about his dignity, his property, his rights as an American citizen. Rights that should never have been violated in the first place. Rights that were violated simply because of the color of his skin. As the chaos continued around him, Marcus thought about his parents. His father had been a police officer for 30 years. His mother had been a schoolteacher. They had raised Marcus to believe in justice. They had raised him to believe that the system could work if good people worked within it. They had raised him to believe that change was possible if you were willing to fight for it. Marcus had dedicated his entire career to that belief. And now, standing in this police station with handcuffs still on his wrists, that belief was being tested in the most personal way imaginable. But Marcus was not going to let this moment break him. He was going to use this moment. He was going to take the evidence that these officers had handed him on a silver platter, and he was going to make sure that every single person responsible faced consequences. Not just Chen and Patterson. Not just Captain Morrison. Everyone who had contributed to the culture that made this arrest possible. Everyone who had looked the other way while black citizens were targeted and humiliated. Everyone who had chosen silence over justice. The door to the interrogation room opened one more time. Assistant U.S. Attorney Lisa Chen walked into that interrogation room like a force of nature. She was flanked by 2 FBI agents in dark suits, their badges visible on their belts, their faces set with the kind of determination that told everyone in that building they meant business. Lisa had been working with Marcus on the civil rights investigation for over a year. She knew every detail of the case. She knew every officer they had been monitoring. She knew every piece of evidence they had collected. And when Marcus missed his scheduled check-in call that afternoon, she had immediately tracked his phone to the Greenville County precinct. Lisa took one look at Marcus, still in handcuffs, still covered in dirt from working his own land, and her expression hardened into something that would have made seasoned criminals nervous. She turned to Captain Morrison, who was standing against the wall looking like he wanted to melt through it and disappear forever. "Captain Morrison," Lisa said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "I am Assistant U.S. Attorney Lisa Chen. Remove those handcuffs from Agent Williams immediately, or I am adding kidnapping of a federal officer to the charges we are already preparing against you and your department." Morrison's hands were shaking so badly that he could barely get the key into the lock. After several agonizing seconds of fumbling, the handcuffs finally clicked open and fell away from Marcus's wrists. Marcus rubbed the red marks where the metal had dug into his skin. Those marks would fade in a few hours. The marks this department had left on its community would take much longer to heal. "Thank you, Lisa," Marcus said calmly. "I appreciate you coming down here personally." Lisa nodded, but her eyes never left Captain Morrison. "When you missed our call, I knew something was wrong. I pulled your phone location and saw you were at this precinct. I have to say, Captain Morrison, when I realized what your officers had done, I almost could not believe it. Almost. Then I remembered everything we have learned about your department over the past 18 months, and suddenly it made perfect sense." Morrison tried to speak. "Ma'am, I can explain. This was a misunderstanding. My officers responded to a legitimate complaint about a trespasser. They had no way of knowing that Mr. Williams was the property owner. These things happen in law enforcement. I am sure you understand." Lisa held up her hand to stop him. "Captain Morrison, I am going to give you some advice. Stop talking. Right now. Everything you say from this moment forward can and will be used against you in federal court. You have the right to an attorney. I strongly suggest you exercise that right immediately, because what I am about to tell you is going to make you wish you had retired last year when you had the chance." The room went completely silent. Officers Chen and Patterson had appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion, and now they stood frozen like deer in headlights. They knew their careers were over. They just did not yet understand how completely over they truly were. Lisa reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder. "Captain Morrison, we have been monitoring your department's communications for 6 months as part of a federal civil rights investigation. We have recordings of every radio transmission, every phone call, every dispatch from the moment Jennifer Hartwell called 911 today to report a suspicious black male on her neighbor's property. We have Officers Chen and Patterson on tape approaching the scene. We have Officer Patterson using racial slurs while transporting Agent Williams to this precinct." Patterson's face went white. "I never said any racial slurs. That is a lie. That is fabricated evidence." Lisa smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Officer Patterson, I have the audio file on my phone right now. Would you like me to play it? Would you like everyone in this room to hear exactly what you said about Agent Williams while you had him handcuffed in the back of your patrol car? Would you like me to tell you the exact timestamp where you referred to him using a word I will not repeat in the setting?" Patterson's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. His career, his pension, his freedom were all evaporating in real time. Everything he had built was crumbling because he could not treat a black man with basic human dignity. But Lisa was not finished. The worst revelation was yet to come. "Captain Morrison," Lisa continued, turning back to the captain. "We also have your phone call from earlier today. The one you made approximately 30 minutes after Agent Williams arrived at this precinct. The one where you instructed your officers to, and I am quoting directly here, teach that trespasser a lesson before bothering to check his identification. Do you remember that call, Captain?" Morrison looked like he might collapse. His back slid down the wall until he was practically sitting on the floor. His mouth was moving but no sound was coming out. He knew exactly what that recording meant. He knew that phone call had transformed this from a case of overzealous policing into a criminal conspiracy. He knew that phone call had sealed his fate. "You did not just authorize harassment today, Captain," Lisa said, her voice cold and precise. "You authorized assault. You authorized false imprisonment. You authorized civil rights violations. And you did all of it on a recorded federal wiretap. You confessed to conspiracy before we even had to build a case against you. You handed us everything we needed to put you away for years." Marcus stepped forward, finally ready to speak. He had spent over an hour in silence, letting these people dig their own graves, documenting their crimes with his patience. Now it was time to let them know exactly what they had done. Captain Morrison, Marcus said, looking down at the broken man slumped against the wall. Do you know why I did not identify myself as FBI when your officers first approached me? Do you know why I let them handcuff me, search me, throw me in the back of their car like a common criminal? Morrison shook his head weakly. Because I wanted to experience exactly what happens to black people in this county when they encounter your officers, Marcus continued. I wanted to know what it feels like to be treated like a suspect for no reason other than the color of my skin. I wanted to document the exact behavior that your victims have been reporting for years. The behavior you have been covering up, dismissing, and ignoring. I wanted evidence that could not be denied, could not be explained away, could not be buried in some internal affairs investigation that goes nowhere. Marcus paused, letting his words sink in. And you gave me that evidence. You gave me everything I needed. Not just today. For 18 months, you and your officers have been building my case for me. Every discriminatory stop. Every false arrest. Every complaint that you buried. Every victim you ignored. All of it is documented. All of it is recorded. All of it is going to be presented in federal court. Lisa stepped forward again. By Monday morning, the Department of Justice will be announcing federal indictments. Captain Robert Morrison. Officers Derek Chen and Michael Patterson. 6 other members of this department who participated in or covered up civil rights violations. Jennifer Hartwell will be facing charges for filing a false police report motivated by racial bias. This is not going to be a slap on the wrist. This is not going to be administrative leave and sensitivity training. This is going to be federal prison. Officer Chen finally spoke, his voice cracking with desperation. I was just doing my job. I was responding to a call. I did not know he was FBI. I did not know he owned the property. Patterson was the one who got physical. Patterson was the one who used slurs. I was just following procedure. Lisa shook her head slowly. Officer Chen, following procedure would have meant verifying Agent Williams' identification before slamming him against his own truck. Following procedure would have meant treating him with basic respect until you had evidence of actual wrongdoing. Following procedure would have meant recognizing FBI credentials when you saw them instead of dismissing them as fake. You did not follow procedure. You followed your bias. And now you are going to face the consequences of that choice. The room fell silent again. The weight of everything that had happened, and everything that was about to happen, pressed down on everyone present. Careers that had taken decades to build were ending in this moment. Lives that had seemed secure just hours ago were now facing complete destruction. All because of choices. Choices to see a black man as a threat. Choices to assume guilt instead of innocence. Choices to abuse power instead of serve the public. Marcus walked toward the door, ready to finally leave this place. But before he stepped out, he turned back one final time. You targeted the wrong black man on the wrong piece of land on the wrong day, Marcus said quietly. My case just became ironclad, and I did not even have to do anything except stand on my own property. I hope it was worth it, Captain Morrison. I hope that phone call telling your officers to teach me a lesson was worth everything you are about to lose. With those words, Marcus Williams walked out of the Greenville County Police Department as a free man. Behind him, he left chaos, fear, and the beginning of the end for everyone who had participated in his humiliation. The investigation that had been building for 18 months was now complete. The evidence was overwhelming. The conspiracy was exposed. And justice, long delayed for so many victims of this corrupt department, was finally coming. The news broke on Monday morning exactly as Lisa Chen had promised. Every major network carried the story. Every newspaper ran it on the front page. Every social media platform exploded with reactions. Federal indictments announced against Greenville County Police Department. FBI agent arrested on his own property. Massive civil rights conspiracy exposed. The headlines wrote themselves, and they were devastating for everyone involved in the corruption that had plagued this department for years. Marcus Williams stood at the window of his home office, looking out at the property that had started all of this. The fence line he had been working on that Saturday afternoon remained unfinished. The tools he had dropped when officers Chen and Patterson arrived were still sitting where he left them. But Marcus was not thinking about fences or tools that morning. He was thinking about justice. He was thinking about all the people who had been victimized by this department long before he ever purchased this land. He was thinking about the voices that had been silenced, the complaints that had been buried, the dignity that had been stolen from so many black citizens who had no badges to protect them and no federal agencies to back them up. Those people were finally going to be heard. The press conference began at 10 o'clock sharp. Assistant U.S. Attorney Lisa Chen stood at the podium, flanked by FBI officials and representatives from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Behind her, a screen displayed the names and photographs of every person being indicted. Captain Robert Morrison, Officer Derek Chen. Officer Michael Patterson. 5 additional officers whose names Marcus had come to know intimately through 18 months of investigation. And Jennifer Hartwell, the neighbor who had started it all with a phone call based on nothing but the color of a man's skin. Lisa spoke clearly and precisely, laying out the charges for the assembled media. Conspiracy to violate civil rights. Assault under color of law. False imprisonment. Obstruction of justice. Filing a false police report. The list went on and on, each charge another nail in the coffin of careers that should have ended years ago. Each charge another step toward justice for victims who had waited far too long. But the most powerful moment of that press conference came when Lisa played the audio recordings. First, the 911 call from Jennifer Hartwell. Her voice dripping with suspicion as she reported a black man on property she had decided he did not belong on. The dispatcher asking if the man was doing anything threatening or illegal. Jennifer admitting that no, he was just working on a fence, but he did not look like he belonged there. The dispatcher asking how she knew he did not belong. Jennifer stumbling over her words, unable to articulate any reason beyond the obvious one she would not say out loud. Then came the radio transmissions from Officers Chen and Patterson. Their casual dismissal of Marcus's claims to own the property. Patterson's escalating aggression. And then, the moment that made everyone in that press room gasp, Patterson using a racial slur to describe Marcus while transporting him to the precinct. The word hung in the air like poison, undeniable proof of the hatred that had motivated this entire encounter. Finally, Lisa played the recording of Captain Morrison's phone call. The call where Morrison had instructed his officers to teach that trespasser a lesson before checking his identification. The call that proved this was not just about 2 bad officers but about a corrupt system that encouraged and protected racist behavior. The call that transformed Captain Robert Morrison from a witness into a defendant. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Community members who had filed complaints against this department for years finally felt validated. Civil rights organizations demanded immediate reforms. Politicians who had previously defended Morrison and his officers suddenly discovered they had always been concerned about the department's practices. The same people who had ignored the problem for years now rushed to position themselves on the right side of history. 3 months later, the federal courthouse in Columbia, South Carolina became the site of the largest civil rights trial in the state's recent history. The courtroom was packed every single day. Community members who had traveled from Greenville County to witness justice being served. Journalists from across the nation documenting every moment. Family members of the defendants watching their loved ones face the consequences of their choices. And victims. So many victims. People who had been stopped, searched, humiliated, and dismissed by this department over the years. People who had filed complaints that went nowhere. People who had been told their experiences did not matter. Now they sat in that courtroom and watched as everything changed. Marcus testified on the 3rd day of the trial. He walked into that courtroom wearing the same suit he wore to work every day at the FBI field office. Professional. Dignified. The complete opposite of how Officers Chen and Patterson had treated him on his own property. He took the witness stand and raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth. Then he told his story. Every detail. Every moment of humiliation. Every word that was spoken to him. Every decision he made to remain silent and let the evidence accumulate. The defense attorneys tried everything to discredit Marcus. They questioned why he did not identify himself as FBI immediately. They suggested he had somehow provoked the officers. They implied that he had been looking for an excuse to entrap their clients. But every argument they made fell apart under the weight of the evidence. The security camera footage showed Marcus smiling and waving at the officers when they first arrived. The audio recordings captured his calm and respectful tone as he tried to explain that he owned the property. The federal wiretaps proved that Captain Morrison had ordered his officers to be aggressive before they even made contact with Marcus. The most powerful moment came when the prosecution played the callback phrases. Those words that Officers Chen and Patterson had used to humiliate Marcus on his own land. Those words that represented everything wrong with how this department had operated for years. "Sure you do," the audio recording played through the courtroom speakers. Officer Chen's sarcastic voice dismissing Marcus's claim to own his property. The prosecutor paused the recording and turned to the jury. "Sure you do. That is what Officer Chen said when a black man told him he owned 15 acres of land. Sure you do. As if black property ownership was so unbelievable that it could only be a lie. Sure you do. As if 20 years of federal service could not possibly result in a black man achieving the American dream." The prosecutor played another clip. "Know your place." Patterson's voice, cold and threatening. "Know your place," the prosecutor repeated. That is what Officer Patterson told a man who was standing on property he owned, Working a fence line he had every right to work, living a life he had every right to live. Know your place. Those words have been used against Black Americans for centuries. Those words are designed to remind us that no matter what we achieve, no matter what we earn, no matter what we build, there will always be someone who believes we do not belong. The prosecutor turned to face the defendants, sitting in their suits and ties, looking nothing like the aggressive officers who had slammed Marcus against his own truck that August afternoon. But today, we have a different message for these defendants. Today, we tell them to know their place. Their place is in a defendant's chair, facing federal charges. Their place is answering for crimes they committed against citizens they swore to protect. Their place is learning that badges and uniforms do not grant immunity from justice. Today, they finally know their place. The courtroom erupted in applause. The judge had to call for order multiple times before the room settled down. But the damage was done. The jury had heard everything they needed to hear. The evidence was overwhelming. The guilt was undeniable. Captain Robert Morrison was convicted on all counts. Conspiracy to violate civil rights. Obstruction of justice. Making false statements to federal investigators. When the judge announced the sentence, Morrison broke down completely. 15 years in federal prison. No possibility of early release. The man who had spent 12 years protecting corrupt officers and burying complaints was going to spend the next 15 years in a cell, thinking about every choice that had led him to this moment. Officer Michael Patterson received 12 years. The man who had slammed Marcus against his truck, who had ignored FBI credentials, who had used racial slurs on a recorded line, who had treated a federal agent like a criminal on his own property, was going to spend over a decade paying for his hatred. When the sentence was announced, Patterson stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. His attorney had promised him that the charges would be reduced, that he would get probation at worst, that no one would send a cop to prison for this. His attorney had been wrong. Officer Derek Chin received 8 years. His defense had tried to paint him as a follower, someone who was just doing what Patterson told him to do, someone who did not realize the situation was escalating. But the jury did not buy it. Chen had seen Marcus's FBI credentials. Chen had known they were arresting a federal agent. Chen had chosen to stay silent and let it happen anyway. That choice cost him 8 years of his life. 5 other officers from the department received sentences ranging from 3 to 7 years each. Officers who had participated in discriminatory stops. Officers who had covered up complaints. Officers who had created the culture that made Marcus's arrest possible. All of them faced federal prison time. All of them lost their careers, their pensions, their freedom. All of them learned that the system they had abused for years could also be used against them. Jennifer Hartwell was convicted of filing a false police report motivated by racial bias. She received 2 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and was ordered to pay restitution to Marcus and to a community fund for victims of racial profiling. But the real punishment for Jennifer was the public exposure. Her name was now forever associated with this case. Her photograph had been shown on every news channel. Her 911 call had been played for the entire nation to hear. She would spend the rest of her life known as the woman who called the police on her black neighbor simply because she could not imagine him owning property next to hers. The Greenville County Police Department was placed under federal oversight. An independent monitor was appointed to supervise all operations. New training programs were mandated. New complaint procedures were implemented. New hiring standards were established. The department that had operated with impunity for years was now answering to federal authorities for every decision they made. But for Marcus, the most meaningful outcome was not the convictions or the sentences or the oversight. The most meaningful outcome was seeing the other victims finally receive validation. Throughout the trial, dozens of people came forward to share their stories. Black men and women who had been stopped, searched, and humiliated by the same officers who had arrested Marcus. Their complaints had been dismissed for years. Their voices had been ignored. But now their experiences were being documented, acknowledged, and used as evidence in a federal prosecution. Now their pain meant something. Now their suffering had consequences. One woman testified about being pulled over 7 times in a single month by Officer Patterson. Each time for a different minor violation. Each time ending with a search of her vehicle. Each time finding nothing. But each time leaving her feeling violated, afraid, and powerless. She cried on the witness stand as she described the fear she felt every time she saw a police car in her rearview mirror. The fear that this would be the time something went wrong. The fear that her children would grow up without their mother because of a traffic stop that escalated for no reason. Another man testified about being detained for 3 hours while officers searched his car and called for drug dogs after he was stopped for a broken taillight. They found nothing. They never found anything. But they kept stopping him anyway. Week after week. month after month. Until he finally moved out of Greenville County entirely, fleeing the place where he had grown up because he no longer felt safe in his own community. Story after story. Voice after voice. Years of abuse finally being acknowledged by a system that had ignored it for far too long. When the trial ended, Marcus drove back to his property in Greenville County. He parked his truck in the same spot where officers Chen and Patterson had slammed him against it 3 months earlier. He walked to the fence line he had been working on that Saturday afternoon. He picked up the tools he had dropped when the officers arrived. And he finished the job. As Marcus set the final fence post, he thought about his father. The man who had worn a police badge for 30 years. The man who had taught Marcus that law enforcement was about service, not power. The man who had believed that the system could work if good people fought to make it work. Marcus wished his father was still alive to see this moment. To see that the fight was worth it. To see that justice, though delayed, could still be delivered. The sun was setting over the rolling hills of Marcus's property when he finally stepped back to admire his completed fence. 15 acres of beautiful South Carolina countryside. Land that he had earned through 20 years of dedication and sacrifice. Land that represented everything he had worked for. Land that no one could ever take from him, no matter what assumptions they made about where he belonged. Marcus pulled out his phone and looked at the dozens of messages he had received since the trial ended. Messages from colleagues congratulating him on the verdicts. Messages from community members thanking him for his courage. Messages from other FBI agents who had followed the case and felt inspired by its outcome. But there was one message that meant more to Marcus than all the others combined. It was from the woman who had been stopped 7 times in 1 month by Officer Patterson. The woman who had cried on the witness stand. The woman whose fear had driven her to change her entire life just to avoid this department. Her message was simple. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for fighting when the rest of us could not. Thank you for proving that our stories mattered. Because of you, I finally feel like I can breathe again. Marcus read that message 3 times before putting his phone away. That was why he did this work. That was why he had dedicated his life to civil rights investigations. That was why he had chosen silence instead of confrontation when those officers approached him on his own land. Because it was never just about him. It was about every black man and woman who had been treated like a criminal for simply existing. It was about every victim whose voice had been silenced. It was about building a world where children could grow up without fearing the people sworn to protect them. The work was not finished. There were other departments, other officers, other systems that needed to be challenged and changed. But on this night, standing on his own land, looking at the fence he had built with his own hands, Marcus allowed himself to feel something he rarely felt in this line of work. Hope. What goes around comes around. The officers who had abused their power found themselves powerless in a federal courtroom. The captain who had buried complaints found his own crimes exposed for the world to see. The neighbor who had assumed a black man did not belong found herself facing national condemnation. No one is above justice. Not the police. Not their supervisors. Not the citizens who weaponize law enforcement against their black neighbors. Everyone answers for their choices eventually. Respect goes both ways. The officers who refused to respect Marcus's dignity lost everything they had built. The system that refused to respect black citizens was torn down and rebuilt under federal supervision. You never know who you are mistreating. Officers Chen and Patterson saw a black man in work clothes and assumed he was a criminal. They could not imagine that the man they were handcuffing owned 15 acres and carried an FBI badge. They could not imagine that their careers would end because they refused to see his humanity. Those are the lessons of this story. Not just for the officers who faced prison time. Not just for the department that faced federal oversight. But for everyone who watches, who listens, who learns. Because the next time you see someone and make assumptions about where they belong, remember Marcus Williams. Remember what happened to the people who assumed he did not belong on his own land. Remember that justice may be delayed, but it does not have to be denied. So let me ask you something. What would you have done in Marcus's situation? Would you have identified yourself immediately and ended the humiliation? Or would you have made the choice Marcus made, staying silent, letting the evidence accumulate, trusting that the truth would eventually come to light? Drop your answer in the comments below. I want to hear what you think. And here is another question. Do you believe the sentences were fair? 15 years for Captain Morrison. 12 years for Officer Patterson. 8 years for Officer Chen. Were those sentences enough for the years of abuse they inflicted on their community? Or should they have faced even harsher punishment? Let me know your thoughts. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with someone who has experienced injustice and needs to know that their story matters. Share it with someone who needs to believe that the system can work when good people fight to make it work. Subscribe to Black Lives Stories for more stories of justice, karma, and the power of truth. Every week, we bring you stories that remind you why we keep fighting. Stories that prove what goes around comes around. Stories that show you what happens when people underestimate the wrong person. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Because when justice comes, you want to be there to witness it. Remember this. You never know whose land you are standing on. You never know whose badge is in that wallet. And you never know when the person you are mistreating is the one who will bring your entire world crashing down. Until next time, stay strong, stay hopeful, and never forget that justice is always worth fighting for.